to start off by introducing our three panellists. To my immediate left here is Chrissie Kane. She is the award-winning author of the memoir Affection and the novels Steeplechase, Triptych, The Adventures of Holly White and the Incredible Sex Machine, the Thomas Shapcott award-winning poetry collection Eating My Grandmother, and her latest novel, An Uncertain Grace, which I think is your debut into science fiction.
Oh, Holly was a little sci-fi too.
Well, aren't they all? So her latest novel is An Uncertain Grace, an exploration of technology and the future. And Chrissie has written and directed broadcast documentaries for SBS and for the ABC. So let's welcome Chrissie. In the middle there is Bec Dean. She's a curator, writer, educator and consultant with a background in photo media and performance art. She is a PhD candidate at the University of New South Wales. She's worked for multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary contemporary arts organisations in Australia since 1996 and has been curating exhibitions and producing events for over 15 years. She was Associate Director of Performance Space, Sydney from 2007 to 2012 and Co-Director from 2012 to 2014. She was the Curator of the Australian Centre for Photography for the National Institute of Experimental Arts at University of New South Wales, towards the Big Anxiety Festival, which is happening.
Happening soon.
Happening this year. And she's the chair of Deluxe Media Arts and an award-winning contemporary performance company, PYT Fairfield. And she's also co-director of Cementa in Candos. And if that wasn't all, she was the co-curator of probably one of the first groundbreaking exhibitions about science fiction and contemporary art, Awfully Wonderful, which she co-curated with Lizzie Mueller in 2011. Let's welcome Beck. Adam's CV goes on for quite some time, so I don't know if I'll read out the entire thing, but Adam was awarded a BFA from the Ruskin School of Drawing and Fine Art, Oxford University in 1984. Recent institutional exhibitions include Beyond Belief, The Sublime in Contemporary Art at the Bathurst Regional Gallery, which I saw and was great. Project Daejeon 2016, Cosmos, the third Biennale of Daejeon at Daejeon Museum of Art in South Korea. War, A Playground Perspective at the Armory at Homebush in 2016. My Trip to Mars at UTS Gallery, University of Technology, Sydney 2015, and he was in the exhibition that I curated, Conquest of Space, Science Fiction and Contemporary Art, which was in 2014. And I just realised Facebook reminded me, Adam, that it's exactly 2 years to the day that we did the Mars panel here at UTS. So join me in welcoming Adam. So I've got my questions here. So one of the propositions that our ACP overlords put to us was this proposal. Today, as science fiction collides with reality through advancements in deep learning, robotics, and artificial intelligence, have visual representations of the predicted future and our ever-shifting present become the dark mirror in which we reflect our current state? So the question is asking us to consider the possibility that science fiction acts as a kind of mirror to the present, although notionally most science fiction films are about the future and they have something to do with technology. That's not their only definition. Science fiction is a very wide field, what I like to call a meta-genre. So a genre which contains many, almost countless sub-genres and sub-sub-genres within it. And some of these stories, these speculations, actually take place in the past. They don't involve any technology. So the question about whether it predicts something or whether it can dramatise for us certain ideas that we have about the future as a cultural idea, collide with these ideas about what it says about the present. Is science fiction only a genre that exists in literary form and cinema, or can we find it elsewhere in contemporary art, children's TV shows, design, the list goes on and on and on. So maybe what we're talking about when we talk about science fiction then is not so much a genre, maybe it's an effect. Maybe it's an idea that we commune with it. Maybe it's an aesthetic. Maybe we'll drill down into some of those ideas in our conversation. But I'd just like to kick off, before we get into the meaty stuff, we're just going through each of the panel members and asking you, perhaps we'll start with you, Adam, because you've got the microphone. Just to how you got into science fiction. What was the first attraction you think it had for you, and I guess the sort of abiding visual memories you have of that science fiction from that period when you first started getting into it?
Okay, well, it was definitely the comic 2000 AD that came out in the UK in 1977. And up until then, I was a sort of ordinary schoolboy reading battle action comics and commando comics, sort of war stories. And this new comic arrived, which was just set in this beautiful, a variety of dystopian sort of stories, sort of American, although this was an English comic, it sort of had an American vibe, and it had very colourful violence. People would, on hoverboards, they would smash into buildings and be splattered all over Megacity 1. And various stories came out of it, like Judge Dredd and big writers like Alan Moore, who wrote the Watchmen thing and various other things, and Neil Gaiman. They were all sort of early writers for 2000 AD. But it was just, I think it was just incredible, and I think it slipped under the radar because it was, the censors weren't really sort of concentrating on kids' comics and just thought it was a sort of shoot 'em up kind of a thing, and they sort of let it go, and all the stories were sort of dystopian, apocalyptical futures, and anyway, it just had me hooked from Prog 1, as it used to be called, or is called now. So that was it, really. I was hooked from then on.
So when was this? Would this have been the early 1980s?
77 I looked it up. Was the first edition.
Do you think, looking back on it, that it was, kind of perfect for its time? Do you think it says something about the way it was made and the style of it spoke to its time?
Very definitely. It did have this. The UK in the late 70s we were in the grip of the nuclear disarmament debate. I think Beck's going to talk about that as well. And that was a real palpable feel at the time. Mutually assured destruction. We were only going to live because if anybody started a fight, we'd all die, which is like a really weird sort of safety sort of system. So I think that's where the sort of apocalyptical nature of all the stories in this comic came from. And I think it was a release. Finally there was a sort of imaginative place to put this fear, and maybe many stories of the era sort of were flavoured by the nuclear situation of the day.
The work that you make as an artist is very much steeped in the visual codes, not just of science fiction, but also of space exploration from probably in the post-war period. Do you think that original influence is still kind of being felt on your work, or that you've moved on from them decisively?
Well, I think you, as an artist, I think I travel around. You go through a sort of corkscrew effect. So you're always moving away from things that you were previously doing, but in some weird sense, you sort of come back to them sort of a few times around the block from a slightly different angle. So I think as a child of I was born in 1964, and I think born in that era, I think I'm just connected to everything that was important in the 60s. And I think those themes so I think they'll be with me all my working life.
Beck, now I know something about you which is somewhat unusual, I guess, that she confessed in an email. well, not confessed, told me, was that she has seen the film Alien possibly more than 1,000 times.
Probably more than 2,000 times.
Now, that film came out in 1979. When did you first
Well, I think
see it, and how has it become such a big part of your life?
It's just an interesting, I guess, it's interesting to grow up with a film and for it to have all of these layers of meaning and difference throughout your life. But I think I first encountered it when I was illegally watching the television late at night, and probably flicked on Channel 4 or something and saw a screening of it and was scared out of my wits. And then we didn't have... I didn't have this kind of rich, imaginative life that was kind of, I guess, supported by all this different kind of genre-based literature and magazines as a young girl. And I think that's probably the experience of a lot of young girls, that we don't sort of necessarily access that kind of material because we're girls. And so I don't have that kind of early story about science fiction. And I continued to watch that film and be obsessed by it for years in my early teens, when it was less taboo. And I actually just put it on in the background while I'm writing or working. Or it has a sonic landscape that I find really soothing, strangely. But also it's one of those films, you know, that once I'd started to do art and train as an artist and get into feminist theory and get hold of Barbara Creed's Monstrous Feminine and see the film kind of critiqued in a different kind of way, and then all these sorts of other layers kind of get added to it. And now when I watch it, I just think it's a really interesting anti-neoliberalism film, you know, like a protest movie. Half of the dialogue is about an industrial relations dispute. The other half is about getting the alien off the ship. And you have Ripley, who's kind of in the centre of all of this, who's basically the canary in the coal mine, just saying something is really wrong here. And basically she gets gaslit through two of these films where people don't believe her, they don't respect her authority, and she ends up being the only one that survives.
So that film was directed by Ridley Scott,
Yeah.
And he has a very, very definitive kind of visual style in that film and others that he's made. But has Alien been a film that has kind of moulded your visual appreciation for science fiction cinema, or are there other perhaps more recent films that you've also gravitated towards, perhaps not in the, if I may say, obsessive-compulsive reviewing of the film?
I think I definitely love the idea of a sort of blue-collar space exploration, that it isn't completely sort of high-def, shiny. It's grubby, it's dirty, there are people doing work, there are miners, it's actually kind of about humanity sort of pushing itself the whole way out, not just an elite kind of group of people in space. So I think, yeah, definitely there's something about that aesthetic that has some value for me, yeah.
So, Krissy, when I was saying that all fiction is science fiction, I think I was perhaps plagiarising Martin Amis, who said that to write any kind of realist fiction in the contemporary world is to take on the language of science fiction. Now, although this novel, most recent novel of yours, is your first full foray into science fiction, what's been some of the visual influences on you over the years that kind of led you to this?
I started as a kid reading science fiction, so it was a very early part of my life was to read. Ray Bradbury was the person who made me want to be a writer, and actually almost every other writer that I know has exactly the same genesis as me, that they read an early Ray Bradbury collection of short stories or a novel and decided that they wanted to write. It's spooky how many people are in the same boat. But also pretty much on loop, probably like you, my grandfather would play Carl Sagan's The Cosmos, which he'd taped off television, I think, and he would just put that on again and again and again. And so, The Cosmos was in the background constantly when I was a kid. And I, unlike, I suppose I didn't have that traditional what you were saying, that girls don't access that sort of stuff. I did. My family encouraged me to read fantasy and science fiction when I was a kid and took me to the museum, and I was a big nerdy kid doing all that kind of stuff. And I think that my rebellion against that happened when I left home and stopped writing science fiction when I went to university and started to look at realist fiction. And it's kind of, for me, it's come full circle because the science fiction crept into my work with The Adventures of Holly White and The Incredible Sex Machine, just because I was in that book. It was a comedy, and so I was allowed to be, I felt like I was allowed to free up and open up my work. And as I did that, I realised that that science fiction is very important to me, and so that crept into that work. And I've been thinking about it ever since, because this new book is completely influenced by my reading in science. And I've done a lot of, as everyone does, picking up New Scientist or Scientific American and reading the articles. And that book was completely influenced by those articles. And I really do think that as a writer working in fiction today, if you're ignoring climate change in your work, if you're ignoring the technology that is, advancing at such an incredible rate, you're kind of harking back to the good old days of, the 50s or something, where you can't kind of embrace technology and you can't bring that into realist fiction, because I think we're no longer writing about the future. I think we're at a cusp where the future is happening so quickly. The future is, instant and happening now. And if we don't incorporate that into our work as novelists, we're really kind of creating this false sense of what now is. And it's similar to some of the writers who hark back to the 50s and how lovely it was then, when it just was horrible for some people. And I really do think that it's important that all writers embrace the science as it's happening right now. And as we're embracing science, we're writing fiction, we're writing science fiction. But it's contemporary, it's now, it's responsive.
I suppose what's interesting is that literature of any kind, in a sense, is a visual medium. It's a thing that produces images in the reader's mind. Is there an analogy to recent science fiction cinema, perhaps, that you drew on, or you find that there's some kind of connection between what you've been doing and what's out there in popular media?
Yeah, look, I was really fascinated by Ex Machina, that was on recently. I'm quite interested in robots from Metropolis, with the wonderful robot in Metropolis, to Ex Machina, to Her, the film that was there about Siri really becoming your lover. This idea, because I write about sexuality as well, and because there's so much in the public imagination about sex robots at the moment. Every time I open up a magazine, we're talking about sex robots. And my book has a chapter in it. It's kind of broken into 5 parts, and one of the parts is about an artificial intelligence that's built as a sex therapy boy, and it's quite a controversial area of research, even with, when you talk about sex robots, people are talking about it in the negative, and people are also talking about them, as I have written in my book, human-formed, human-shaped robots. But actually, if you're going to make a sex robot, I would, encourage people to make flannelette pyjamas that is responsive to your mood, that, doesn't look like a human at all, but your robot is your flannies that you put on, and that they're not human-shaped. But we're terrified. There's something about the human imagination that we're terrified of, this idea that the one thing that we have left as humans between each other is sex and love, and that if that's suddenly, better with a robot, that we will be replaced in some way. And that's fascinating to me. So there's quite a lot of films that are kind of dealing with that, and I think it's interesting.
That actually segues very nicely to the next point I wanted to discuss. So let's pick up on this thing that you just mentioned here, the robots as I guess a kind of symbol or metaphor for different kinds of human situations and the human condition. I mean, this seemed to be amongst a huge plethora of science fiction media that's out there at the moment. I was just thinking of Westworld along with Her and Ex Machina.
And there's a great British TV series as well that's way better than Westworld, I think. I can't remember what it's called. Can anyone remember? Humans.
Yeah.
Oh, it's amazing and it's beautiful.
So why do you think that this particular fiction has such traction at the moment? What for you, reflecting on that, do you have any thoughts on why it has such currency?
I think the idea of us not being in charge of the technology anymore is terrifying for people. I think the fact is we as individuals are not in charge of it. We can't understand the technology anymore. And as we approach, quantum computing, we're never going to be able to understand what's going on. Like there was, did you guys recently hear about the artificial intelligence they started to talk, they invented their own language and were talking to each other in a language that the programmers couldn't understand, and the programmers turned them off because, it's like, I don't know what they're saying. Are they going to start a revolution and kill us? There's this terror that we've lost control, and I think a human-shaped artificial intelligence that has, a faster capacity to think through problems is terrifying for us.
Beck, your exhibition that you co-curated with Lizzie Mueller had a really interesting, one of many really interesting ideas within its kind of conceptual parameters, which was the idea of speculative objects and speculative machines. Can you talk a little bit about what they were in the show and how they kind of related to this idea of embodying the future within a material object?
So basically we had this conversation going on with Matthew Connell, who is a senior curator at the Powerhouse Museum, and he's the senior curator of technology, and obviously has access to thousands of incredible technological objects. And within that collection there are some quite extraordinary pieces. But when we go to see them now, being so immersed in the digital, we actually find them strange again. And they kind of almost become speculative objects once more because we have lost our ability to actually engage with them and to engage with their technological potential. So we're kind of looking at this sort of science fictions of futures past, as well as looking at the kinds of ideas that artists were pushing.
Can you talk about what sort of objects you had?
So we had a vibrator, which was, I think, one of the first vibrators that was used in Sydney for the treatment of female hysteria, and it actually belonged to a surgeon who was, in fact, presumed to have actually murdered a few of his patients. So it's this kind of very odd-looking object with a kind of a phallic kind of implement that has all of this kind of strange kind of history locked into it. There are also cosmological tools, sort of tools for looking at the universe, using mirrors and scopes and a whole range of things that seem that we actually don't know how to engage with because we're so used to dealing with these screens to tell us all of this information now. Also, recording devices and wax tubes that hold all of these.
I may have a false memory implant, but
yeah.
Was there not also an early computer or something?
Yes, there was a ZX80 as well. Yes.
Yeah, which was a computer from the 80s.
Yes.
Now, I remember this object very well because it brought back a lot of nostalgic memories of computing class in high school. But one of the things I thought when I saw that object in the show was how certain design objects had this, not only just to kind of exemplify the time in which they were made, but also kind of design ethos that was future oriented, and that seemed to be an object that contain both of those things simultaneously. Was that something that you'd responded to?
That object in particular?
Yeah.
I think also, like the William Gibson novel, no, not Neuromancer. I think it's Idoru. It's a novel where he explores this kind of black market for these sorts of early computational devices and early computers, and I think it's one of the objects that is kind of traded or sought for in that novel. So it's kind of like they take on this sort of almost mythological kind of property over time as they become more scarce. And
it's interesting because as a design object, it's something that I guess it's sort of in a way a bit similar to Apple products, some adult Apple products, or perhaps some new kind of technology, new iteration of technology that comes into your hand, and it seems both to be of the present moment, but also somehow about the future as well.
Yeah.
It seemed to be connected to some future idea. But do you think that's a quality of the thinking of now, or do you think it's a genuine sense of the future?
that quality of seeing.
Having a sense that this object somehow contains within it some sort of suggestion of the future.
I think definitely when all of those products are put onto the market, they have to sell themselves for that. They have to sell themselves for the 2 years that they're going to be used, I guess, in this context. And 6 months. Some people replace their objects so quickly now that I'm sure that is part of a design ethos to sort of create desire around a futuristic possibility.
I'd like to carry this point over to you, Adam, because a lot of the work that you've done has delved into various aspects of the post-war space race. And a lot of those objects and images that you've conjured up in a kind of nostalgic way, in some sense, also engages with the cultural notion that those objects of the 50s and 60s, let's say, had a sense of the future in them, or of an impending future, of the colonisation of space and Moon and Mars and whatever.
Sure. Just to sort of slightly answer that question, I read a very good quote. I can't remember who it was, but they basically said that the Apollo space program was the last gasp of Victorian engineering, and I think what they meant by that was if you think of a train, a steam train, as the most important sort of object of Victorian engineering, and put it on its end, and make the stuff inside the tube come out really fast, that's it. The Apollo rockets were really just very, very efficient steam trains that went upwards, and if you look on the outside of them, they're steel and aluminium plates riveted in the old-fashioned way of steam. They're built like steamships. But of course, over the top of that, you put this sort of space-like gloss. So when the Mercury Astronauts, the panel of selected astronauts, or Gemini, I think, Gemini and Mercury were first selected, they appeared in silver spacesuits, and they were basically just they were basically just pilot uniforms that they'd been sprayed silver, and you could see that their military boots were sprayed silver, so they were made to look more spacey because they were going to space. And so they were just, if you have a look at the photo, they're all just wearing army boots, but with the silver spray over the top. And also, one thing about the design of space that I rather like is that if you look at all the different rockets from the different nations, they seem to have a sort of view. They seem to feel a little bit like, like a Russian space rocket looks Russian, and a Chinese one looks a little bit Chinese, and an American one looks American. I don't know what it is about how. Obviously they're doing exactly the same thing, but there's something to do with how they're designed that seem to have incorporated something to do with the character of the nation that made them. So American, I'm about to go off to spend 3 or 4 months in California, and one of my hopes is I'm going down to outside Tucson. There's the Davis Monthan Air Base, which is basically the bone orchard for all the Saturn rocket parts that still exist, and it's where all the spacecraft and aeroplanes and old B-52s and stuff are kind of warehoused out in the desert, so you can go and drive around. And I just want to sort of have a look at the bits and pieces, you know, to see whether or not they're specific to you know, the era or not. Because as an artist of the 60s, and I think I deal very much with the physical objects of that era, I don't know how artists of the future are going to manage, because it's all hidden in a box that you don't know how it goes together. So I imagine there's a jump that younger artists will presumably make.
Jump back to analogue.
Sure. I mean, basically, analog, you can touch it. You can see the history of riveting, for instance, from steel ships through to aluminium rockets.
I just wanted to follow up that point, just to ask you about the performance piece that you did for Beck and Lizzie's show, Awfully Wonderful, which was called Mars Gravity Simulator.
Yeah.
Which recreated a real Apollo era, I think, simulator, gravity simulator for astronauts to become accustomed to the kinds of weightlessness effects that they would experience on the moon. Now, this work basically involved Adam in an orange jumpsuit with a quasi-crash helmet come space helmet on a very large spring bounding around the outside of a circular...
A frustrum, a cone.
Right. And then around this were a couple of other collaborators dressed as scientists in white lab coats, recording and videoing the whole thing. So on one level, I suppose, that's the kind of, I guess, the way I interpreted it, was that for you there was a kind of joy in inserting yourself into this story, into this methodology of space exploration and so forth. But I'm interested in what your thoughts are on the iconic nature of those kinds of images. Because to me, it seemed to have a very strong sense of its time, the 1960s.
I think that's true. And like I just hinted at before, you know, it's the analog version of science where you can actually make a little bit of it yourself and experience it. And my piece for Awfully Wonderful was Mars Gravity Simulator, and it was a method in the very early days of the Apollo space program where they didn't have any experience in space. They had to come up with a technique to try out how to wear spacesuits in microgravity or less gravity, and so they came up with this system of pulleys and ropes and what have you, and I converted that to the Martian gravity parameters, which are different to the Moon ones. But it was incredibly doable. My equipment was exactly the same, more or less, give or take a couple of million in budget, between what the Apollo era scientists use and we could recreate in performance space. It was just a series of ropes and pulleys and just a little bit of clever science, just basically turning a human being at an angle to the ground, and the angle changes your gives you a proportion of gravity rather than the whole of gravity. But it was really doable, and it was. I mean, lots of people wanted to have a go. Obviously, the insurance wasn't available for that. But it would have been lovely to give people a go, because you really did feel. You did experience less gravity, and not only were you lighter. I could run for 10 minutes on that machine. I can't do that now. In gravity 1, but in gravity point 4, it was relatively easy. And yes, it was. I think I was born in an era where, science was still a thing that you could do on the kitchen table, and I still love. I think the connection with aliens is that sort of blue collar thing. It's real people sort of connected to science, and I think that's what I'm trying to do in my work, is bring forward this shared joy that these are really doable things.
Can I just say, there was also 2011 when we did the show. I think it was also the year that the US NASA had closed a lot of its manned space programs. And so it was also quite a sad moment. I remember us all kind of reflecting on that at the time, but, it was a while ago. But it seemed to be closing the door on a whole range of those possibilities, those particular futures that had,
Well, it was
poor Adam, poor child Adam.
So I want to get to the core question here about asking whether does SF hold a mirror to the present? Is it about the future or the present moment? A little while ago, I saw a film made in 1930 called Just Imagine, which is essentially a musical review about the future, kind of a cavalcade of stars of the day doing kind of little skits. It's like the numbskull version of Metropolis. It's got a giant city with flying cars and so forth, all of the tropes. But the key character, the audience's anchor into all of this, is, I thought, was a Jewish stereotype. Turns out it was supposed to be, I found out on reading, a Swedish immigrant, which was a particular ethnic type of the day, which was the persona of this stand-up comedian, a vaudeville guy. And he would go through the city and he'd meet various people and they'd show him the wonders of the future. Now, the film was set 50 years in the future, so what life was going to be like in 1980. So aside from all of the stupid stuff, that there were wing walkers and people doing musical numbers in space and all this kind of stuff. One of the earliest sequences in the film is the Swedish immigrant being taken to a restaurant, and he's very excited because he hasn't had a good meal since he arrived in New York, and he's taken to a series of vending machines. And the New Yorkers, who are very enthusiastic about the vending machines, tell him that this is the best food in the city. And the big gag is, of course, that it's a vending machine. But what struck me about this film, no matter how awful it was in retrospect and how torturous it was to sit through minutes upon minutes of unfunny comedy, was that it did actually say something about the way people in 1930 imagined that the future would be in 1980, and that was convenience. The idea that things could be presented instantaneously without effort. That if you were hungry, it came out of a machine. And in a strange way, it seemed accurate. The whole notion of going to a restaurant is something that perhaps people, even until very recently, was only something done very rarely and on special occasions. So I'm wondering, if science fiction predicts the future, are there any examples that you could think of from your own experience with looking at science fiction cinema, or in fact literature, that have made either direct or indirect accurate predictions about what the future has brought? Beck?
Just sort of recently reading some Philip K. Dick novels. I think that a lot of his work is entirely kind of prescient. The levels of surveillance that we kind of now just take for granted as part of our culture, and self-surveillance and paranoia and drug use and and kind of addictions to alternative realities. So that's my 2 cents on that in terms of, of that work.
Recently I've been watching the Margaret Atwood Handmaid's Tale and rereading the book, you can say, well, this is not the world now, but there's, a lot in that book that is, happening now, and that was written in 1984. And, even in 1984, that's when George Orwell set his book, which is kind of also happening now. And, there are all these people that maybe they didn't get the exact details of what it's going to be like in the future, but they knew human nature enough to extrapolate on where we would take, what path we would go down. And there's, Stanislaw Lem, who is a science fiction writer, wrote a book called Summa Technologiae, and that was written in, I think, the 30s, maybe the 40s, and it was his kind of predictions of the future. And I haven't read the book itself, but I was reading a physicist who was at a conference, a futurist conference, and said, reading this book, everything that he predicted in that book has come true today. And I think it's because the science fiction writers, they have the freedom to kind of take everything that's happening there within the culture and to just follow that thread and to see where that thread leads them. And I think that's the important thing. It's not whether they're wearing the kind of winged boots or have their hovercraft, although we, really wish we had a hovercraft. But it's just seeing how we unravel our own community if we continue along the track that we've set out to be. And that's the importance of science fiction, I think.
You can also play the Star Trek game and think, what on the original Star Trek series have they now made? Because, of course, the mobile phone is the most obvious one. Beam me up, Scotty. He's talking into a little flip open sort of mobile phone. But our mobile phones can actually do 10 times more than his could. His could only speak to one other thing, which was the Enterprise.
They teleported a photon.
Well, they have, but also I think we've got the very beginnings of teleportation because 3D printing. If you put that, if you connect that to the plans being sent through computers, through the internet and arriving somewhere else. I mean, I think they're going to put a 3D printer on the International Space Station so that whenever they need a part, they can just print it rather than send it up. And of course, that's the very, very beginning of teleportation. These are non-live objects, but if they could, basically they have to break you down into molecules and then rebuild you somewhere else. So I think we're at the very dawn of teleportation. If you can link technologies that are now getting very sophisticated together. But that's just great, the idea of your car breaks down in the middle of the desert and you just arrive at a garage and they have no spare parts whatsoever. They just have a 3D printer and they just print the part from download it from the internet and bolt it on and away you go. That's a good start. I think that's going to come soon, isn't it?
I think Neil Stephenson wrote about these matter machines that produced whatever you programmed into them to produce, from food to basic mattresses and other sorts of utilitarian objects.
Everybody's got one.
Yeah.
And Angela Carter has in the Incredible Design Machines of Dr. Hoffman has like VR, like Google Glass, really only without the glass, that there's these kind of images and holograms that are being produced and populating the world and sending people crazy. And Stanislaw Lem also predicted that in his Summa Technologiae, but it's actually happening now, the kind of VR stuff.
IVF. That's the sort of great promise of the future for women as well, is that we wouldn't be confined to the maternal, because we would be able to outsource it to machines, and so there's the beginnings of that also, more than the beginnings of that.
Some early a collection of feminist science fiction from the early 70s, and one of the stories was about the dramatic moment where a woman was carrying another woman's baby to conception. And this was something where the fiction was both about the speculative technology where this would be able to happen, but also the social context for all of those things. I I think one of the glorious things of Star Trek in particular, and the Next Generation and on, is this idea of the replicator. That all you need is something called matter, and then you can transform it into anything from food to a cup of Earl Grey tea to virtual humans on a holodeck, and all of this kind of idea about, I guess, virtual entertainment and so on. But it just has that one other missing factor right now that we don't have, which is this thing called matter. But I just want to go back to this idea of prediction. Recently, Alfonso Cuarón's film, Children of Men, which I think came out in 2008, was having its anniversary and of release, and it was remarked upon how prescient that film was in terms of describing the present moment. This is a film from basically a decade ago, which describes warfare, terrorism, refugee crisis, ecological degradation. Now, all of these things are with us, and they're described in that film in a way that is disturbingly familiar. My question to you, though, is, are these things that we're describing in terms of predictions inevitable anyway? Is this a kind of cultural imagining of these things that helps along the practical idea of bringing matter into existence?
I think it's also, I just wanted to kind of reflect back on Children of Men and The Handmaid's Tale, is that a lot of these dystopian futures have already happened. They have happened. They just haven't happened to us specifically. There have been genocides. There have been, the whole, US was colonised by slavers. And so the experience of people of colour watching The Handmaid's Tale on TV has been remarked upon in terms of how good of a deal actually Offred's kind of getting in relationship to those experiences of the past. So I think that it's that idea of these things kind of being in circulation and they're not really evenly distributed.
No, and I mean, I think one of the really interesting events of recent weeks was the announcement by the producers of Game of Thrones that they're planning to make an alternative history science fiction series based on the idea that the Confederacy won the Civil War, or at least is still in existence in modern times. Now that idea, even before the events of this week, was hugely problematic in terms of what it says about the lived experience of people of colour of now, let alone the past. And there was a lot of argument about whether fiction had the right to step into that space and talk about it. I'd be interested to hear your views.
Fiction has it needs to step into a space and sort of tease it all out, because it's the only safe place to have that conversation. Like, we can't just have an experiment where terrible things happen and let's see how it works. And I think, I've, with the book that I was writing recently, I've had a little bit of flack in terms of my looking at sexual predation and my kind of intersecting with that and kind of looking at that as an issue within the book. And that, and I really approached it incredibly cautiously, knowing that it would be a point that would trigger people into being very kind of, heated about the issue rather than thinking about what was happening within the book. And I think that it's fiction that we need to have those conversations in, because there's nowhere else to be able to have that conversation about is there a way that we can cure people of pedophilic ideation? Is there a way of doing that, and what technology would we use to do that is something that we can talk about in fiction, but we can't, in real life have that conversation at this point. So I think that it really is, it's the job of a fiction writer to step into the tricky areas and to bring that out. And, there's people who make video games that get criticised all the time for, putting things out there that might get people addicted to killing people or whatever. But we know the difference between fantasy and reality. We understand that difference, and we need some venue where we can talk about the hard issues.
One of the really interesting aspects of alternative history as a subgenre of science fiction is its ability to upend, if you like, the political orthodoxies of the present time. Man in the High Castle, which is based on a Philip K. Dick novel and is a series on Amazon, imagines a post-World War II scenario where Japan and Germany won the war, and it takes place in the 1960s, beginning of the 1960s in America. And one of the things about it is that there's a sort of lurid intensity to the way the story is told because it seems incredibly plausible. And the resonances between things that are depicted in the series, like a kind of quasi-Christianity, state religion of the Nazis, meeting with a kind of, apostolic Christian attitudes of the Americans, the way those two things join within the series is incredibly confronting, but it's safely in the past. It's safely in the past in a way, although when they did promote the show, there was a lot of furor over what people discerned as Nazi swastikas and Japanese rising suns that were displayed in ads on the New York subway and elsewhere, because the whole orthodoxy of the post-war consensus is that evil was defeated, and to entertain the idea of this, as you were saying, Krissy, is hugely volatile and needs to be teased out in a way within fiction. And when we were talking about the sorts of science fiction films and books and so on forth that we were reading, I think it was you, Adam, who mentioned Ian M. Banks.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if Banks for you was an author whose works described the present time, or is it for you a sense of the future within his fiction?
For those of you who don't know, Ian M. Banks, as opposed to Ian Banks, wrote a series of science fiction novels. They're interlinked. They're not the same story, but they're set in this mythical future civilization called the Culture, and basically it's a sort of perfect idyll in some ways. Virtually all human problems are sort of solved. You live to 300 or 400 years old. You know, you can change sex. You can spend 10 decades as a woman and go back to a man, experience this or that. You can move to different planets and do whatever you like. And the whole world is run by, all these worlds are run by sort of benign computers called minds that are basically the whole planet. So it's a sort of libertarian idyll in the sense that you could go off into this cosmology or galaxy and live whatever kind of life you liked, and we never really find out. The only issues or the only problems to the culture are sort of external ones from outside, which always seem to be easily dealt with somehow by the end of the novel. By some incredibly clever computer who just always had a handle on it anyway. And we just watch, in the novels, you just watch the individual human beings move around doing ordinary human things. And I think to me, it is the sort of the perfect end of sci-fi in that. I mean, sadly, Ian M. Banks died a few years ago, you know, so we're not going to get any more, because I think every follower of him just wanted more stories, you know, and maybe modern writers or newer writers will just take it on and do more, because I don't think they've made a film of any yet, have they? So it's definitely going to be a filmic universe sometime in the near future. But I mean, so it's not the dark mirror. It's in some ways it's the perfect mirror, isn't it? It's the perfect future with everything cured and solved. And in fact, the protagonists within the stories usually go off somewhere else to confront a group of people that aren't as enlightened, or they're problematic in some other way. So if you like, they leave their perfect world behind to go and experience a sort of medieval society that needs a little bit of updating, you know, and brought into the fold.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's like Game of Thrones could exist within that kind of universe, but they're being looked after by a bunch of other minds that just keeping the lid on that.
No, absolutely. The end of Game of Thrones would be the culture just taking over and saying, okay, well, we'll deal with it from here. You'll be fine. So I'm still wondering whether or not the culture is the perfect future.
It's a sort of a utopian society in a way, because it's a post-scarcity world in which everything is there. There's no reason to work. There's no reason for money. There's no need for conflict. The saying of the culture is that money implies poverty. You only have poverty when there's money, so let's not have any money. You know, it has a sort of socialist aspect to it. And the reason that I was asking about that is because it seems to me that it, as a sort of science fiction universe, it is utopian, which seems very much at odds with the sorts of visions we have of the future right now, where there's a sense that only dystopias, either of the future or an alternate past, seem to make any sense to us now. How do we feel about that, Beck? What do you think?
Well, you know, we're the sort of dominant life form on the planet by a long shot, and I guess the exponential growth of that population kind of leads one towards a few possible conclusions, you know, including enormous epidemics or, you know, the world kind of not being able to support us anymore in terms of food or just the increase of the planetary temperatures making it impossible for us to live. So it's kind of hard to avoid that 7.5 billion person fact.
There's a fantastic TV series called Utopia, not the Utopia that we're watching at the moment, although I love that. But it's based on a comic book, and I'm giving a bit of a spoiler here, but one of the kind of, in the first season, one of the things that you find out is that it's actually kind of an environmental group that is releasing the thing that's going to painlessly make people not be able to have children, and so that they won't continue to spread the population. And it's really an ethical conundrum because, you know, that in a way that's a really good thing. Like, to actually limit the population would be a really environmentally important thing to do. But we also know that the people that have the most populations on those continents are the people that cause less destruction to the planet. So you kind of, you've got this kind of weird unbalance between the less populated continents with the richest populations on it doing the most damage, and the people with lots and lots of people doing hardly any damage at all to the planet. And yeah, it's a really interesting kind of question as to whether the fact that we're human-centric in our culture, whether that's the problem, and the idea that we keep thinking of ourselves as human, I think is an issue, because we're not. You know, we're like 52% of ourselves is not human. Well, it's, you know, viral and, you know, a mitochondrian, and there's so much in us that when to call ourselves human, we have to kind of realise that we're actually a whole bunch of tiny little things that is a person, and that we're also a part of this giant complex thing.
I was listening to an interview with an author whose name I've momentarily forgotten, who'd written a book on, it was something like 50 machines or 50 inventions that can save the world. And I was listening to him on the radio, and he was talking about all the sorts of technology that could be created to get us out of the problems that we find ourselves in. For example, gigantic atmosphere scrubbers. They're going to somehow suck all the carbon out of the atmosphere. And he was talking about these different things, you know, cleaning the plastics out of the sea. Well, we can build this machine. We can do all these things. And for a while, when I was listening to this in the car on the radio, I was thinking, yes, we can do this. The technological utopia is just around the corner. But it faded away. Just as soon as the interview was over, it just didn't feel like the utopian vision of the future that was in, say, 2001: A Space Odyssey is likely. So do you think this is an issue with the genre, or is it an issue with the audience? That the dystopia seems like the only viable fiction?
I think that At the moment, the human-centric kind of way that we operate is the major issue, because all of those inventions require us to do nothing. They require us to make no changes to the way that we live or the way that we reflect upon our environment and our relationship to it, or the other ecologies that make our life possible. They just want to erase the sort of the problem that's created at the top. So I think that's I've been talking to people that work in earth jurisprudence, so people that are creating laws so that rivers and lakes and other naturally occurring features of the landscape actually have rights. And I think that's a really interesting kind of pathway for a science fictional endeavour.
What's your view, Adam? Because to take it back to the beginning of our discussion, 2000 AD was a kind of like a satirically dystopian magazine, and all the stories kind of within it fitted into that kind of late Cold War thinking. Do you think it's still relevant now?
Well, I think even more so. I mean, I don't know what everybody else feels, but I definitely feel that the world has sort of gone backwards in the last sort of decade or so. I used to think sort of scientific thinking was going to be the thing that saved us, but we seem to be all over the world being dragged back into conservative sort of thinking, which seems to be very unprogressive. So, I mean, I just never thought we'd be, looking at the world now compared to the 70s, I never thought we'd be in a world where less people believed in science, not more people. So I thought we'd be working it out now, because lots of these issues, whether it's either a big giant machine or all of us working together, they're all solvable. They're all immensely solvable. The technology's all here. I mean, even, we can recycle everything. Why do we even make something that can't be recycled? Why can't it just be taken apart and put back to future use? So, like an earlier version of your matter that you were talking about, just split to its constituent parts. So maybe we need the dystopian science fiction to sort of, scare us up a little bit more and get us working it out. I never thought we'd get this far down the line with climate change being denied, because it seems eminently fixable. We just have to have less. And I know that's an easy thing to say and a difficult thing to do, but it just doesn't. It is a little scary, and maybe dystopia is going to be the only way we can scare ourselves into getting anything done. But maybe that's the problem. Maybe that's what's scaring the Conservatives into sort of, let's go back to the 50s where people were respectful of each other and things were safe. I don't know. Is the alt-right scared of the future? This sort of beautiful, rational future. Are they scared of it, or do they want to go back to the 50s where people died in childbirth and a cut could go gangrenous? I mean, what bit of it do they want? Because they obviously want the science of it, but not the future of it. So I'm not quite sure where we are. I think it's definitely a discussion for the to go on and on.
I think we have time for some questions about now. Yeah, we've got about 20 minutes.
I can just add a point to that.
Sure.
I'm just reading this fantastic book by Donna Haraway, which is called Sticking with the Trouble, or Staying with the Trouble, and it she suggests that because we kind of are facing, climate change and all these terrible things, that there seem to be two major responses to that, and one of them is that let's make it lead it out to dystopia, that we'll be we'll just tease that out and we'll be really afraid. And the other thing is to stick our head in the ground and not do anything about it because we feel like, well, you know, we can't do anything, so we're just not going to do anything, which is the kind of alt-right reaction to it. And you know, her kind of suggestion in her book is that we see that we're just one of many things that need to work together to fix this, and that we need to actually have a complete cultural shift, which is a really, really hard thing. But I think that, you know, if we can, you know, if the economy crashes globally, that we can start thinking about having a complete cultural shift where we look at things in a different way to fix them.
Well, maybe I could throw a question out to the audience and maybe someone would like to answer it. One of the propositions that was posed for this panel was the idea that maybe we would reached a moment of peak relevance for science fiction. What do we think about that idea? I mean, there's a lot of TV shows, a lot of movies around. Is it saying anything about where we are right now or where we're going?
Audience don't like participation.
This is like lecturing again, yeah.
I don't think we can reach the peak. We will reach the peak. I mean, it's endless. Like, just listening here, like, you know, the idea of recycling things. And sparked an idea in my mind that, like, what would be like if we're in a future where everything is recycled? What will it do to the businesses? What will it do to the establishment? What will it do for the, you know, majority? Like that, I don't have the answers, but that's what I ended up thinking just in this couple of minutes.
David, were you putting your hand over?
I think we've become a bit cynical because I think the market has hijacked technology. We no longer build technology for altruistic reasons, which is part of science fiction imagination. And I feel as though we've been sold a bit of a puppy when it comes to technology because it's become just a market-driven imperative now. And I think we've become really cynical in regards to the future. So I think we're in a low point.
Although, you know, I was just doing a bit of research on LIGO and gravitational waves, and the fact that those people who invented, you know, who created LIGO, they didn't know what was going to happen. They just knew that they wanted to solve this issue of gravitational waves, and it took, you know, 100 years from the time that Einstein suggested that there were gravitational waves to finally discovering it, and they managed to sell that, and we've also managed to sell the Large Hadron Collider, and we didn't know that we were going to get any particles out of that at all, any new particles, and I think that gives me hope on a big scale like that, and when countries work together, that we just do stuff just for the heck of science.
We also have Elon Musk intervening in South Australia's energy crisis. Like, I think that's, I mean, you know, he is a little bit of a dick, but he's kind of one of those, he's a man of futures past in a way, isn't he? Saint. He's kind of like the sort of one of those kind of standalone. No, but he seems to be wanting to be a leader of this future, of this bright, shiny future.
Yes, well, he's very much imbued with the whole history of technology. I mean, you know, he aside from all many other things that he's done, did an archaeological recovery of the remains of Saturn V booster rockets that were used in the Apollo program from the ocean floor near Florida. I mean, the guy is, you know, kind of the embodiment of the West Coast technological dream, future, utopian state. Do we have any other questions?
I guess I have a question.
Yeah.
I've kind of been really interested in the ideas around accelerationism and how technology it's developing at such an incredible rate. And then when I think about how literary works in particular being written outside of the context that we're currently reading them in, what kind of implications we might face around, you know, the reflection on our current context from new works being developed just in the next couple of years, and how quickly it all will change. Will we have a 1984 from 2017?
One of the things, Andrew and I are both on the board of an organisation called Deluxe, And it's an organisation that kind of promotes new media practice, digital media practices. And one of our other board members was talking about digital literacy and the fact that while there are a lot of young people using technology, it's a very, very small proportion of those young people that actually know anything about the technology that they're using. So there's this kind of strange thing going on with that acceleration where people are becoming actually less informed about the material, the platforms that they're actually using.
But I do think that, I think you're right. I think people, I still can't figure out how a record player ever got made in the first place. But I do think that we are seeing people write the 1984s of the future. Every one of the really good literary fiction writers that I admire is dealing with, at least climate change, if not some kind of technological advance. With Margaret Atwood writing her Oryx and Crake series, and David Mitchell, and there's when you turn to capital literary fiction, you've got a really rising group of people who are writing classics, and people are not necessarily seeing them as science fiction because we still have this kind of idea that science fiction is a really narrow thing that only involves spaceships and only involves cosmology, and we don't even think about, all of the internal kind of medical stuff within us. But we are seeing these books being written now, and I think that they're going to stand. I think they'll stand in the future.
Yeah.
Funny for me to ask a question, but do you not think that all fiction has to be science fiction now? Because the iPhone's only 10 years old, and yet to write a novel now where you didn't have a smartphone being a major interplayer, it's like my kids don't know what a telephone used to look like.
Yeah, I think the future is happening now. The future is tomorrow, and it's happening so quickly that we can't possibly write literary fiction without it being a historical fiction that we're writing if it doesn't engage with the technology.
That's what I meant.
Yeah, I don't think we can, but people are. People are, and it's, some people are writing some really beautiful historical fiction that's called literary fiction, and it's not engaging with any of the technology. And I think that we've got a situation where, particularly in Australia, and I suppose in the Western countries in general, we've got this group of, and they're all men that are older than a particular age, who have been the ones who are the canon. It's all male, these male writers who are the canon, and they're now past a particular age. They didn't grow up with technology. They don't understand it. They're the ones who are kind of going, and just not dealing with it because it's too hard. And I'm not saying that all guys do this, but certainly a lot of people from the literary canon have done this and have just decided not to deal with it. And I think that there's going to be there is a generational change happening now. We're seeing those people who were the heroes of literary fiction dying, and we're seeing black faces, we're seeing female faces, we're seeing Asian faces, we're seeing people with voices that haven't been able to push through that canopy of great, tall, giant male trees are beginning to come up and come up with new ideas, and they're engaging with the technology.
I'd like to just finish off our conversation with a very brief anecdote. One of my favourite science fiction films that I used to watch whenever it came on television when I was a kid, was a film that came out, I think, about 1972, called Colossus, the Forbin Project. It's a fantastic colour B movie that came out in the US. And basically it's about the American military under the direction of a genius German accented scientist named Dr. Forbin, who advises them to be tactically and strategically superior to the Russians. They need to build a supercomputer that will take over everything. And so they build it, and it's called Colossus. When they turn it on, they almost immediately discover that there's a Russian computer called a Guardian, and they start talking to one another. They try to stop it, but they can't stop it. And eventually the computers start talking to each other, and then they very quickly develop a language of mathematics that no one else can understand.
Didn't that just happen?
Yes.
Amongst the other amazing technological advancements that the computers produce is the ability for them to speak. And the first thing that the computer says is, "This is the voice of world control." From that point on, they're completely stuffed. Because now they have two computers acting as one that have complete control of the nuclear arsenals of both Russia and America, and every segment of society will do what the computers tell them to do for a better tomorrow. I went to the movies recently, and I think it was War for the Planet of the Apes. And before the film started, there was an ad for a small box about this big called Google Home. Would you join me in thanking Krissy, Beck and Adam?